Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. If you look at the overview of my talk, you'll realize that I'm going to be essentially repeating in a slightly less eloquent way much of what was discussed so far today, with a couple of examples I hope that are new and stem from CCI. But I think it's despite that slightly awkward feeling that you get as a speaker when you realize that you will be repeating some of what the audience may already have heard. I think in some ways the kind of the confluence of some of these points is actually a very healthy sign. The fact that we're talking about the same sorts of things and we're not wildly kind of divergent and off on different pages, really, gives me, well, either we're too inbred, which I hope not, or it really gives me hope that we're kind of achieving some sort of consensus about the direction that we need to move. And certainly, kind of coming on the heels of Scott's presentation, while the specific examples will differ in my talk, some of the points that I'd like to actually wind up making really are the same, and in essence that trying to move kind of our breeding and training and utilization of animals from what you could call, I guess, a craft into a science-based technology. Although one of my conclusions, as you'll see from the bottom bullet point, is that I think we have to be careful of not being too hubristic about the power of science and remaining somewhat humble about the degree to which we understand what's going on with even seemingly the simplest problems. And I hope I chose two examples to talk about today when I actually get to the part about some of the stuff that we're doing at CCI, that I hope kind of illustrate that, because for me they were, the conclusions were not at all what I would have predicted before we went into it. So they were a surprise to me. Perhaps they were a surprise only to me, but they were a surprise to me. And I think they do serve as a pretty good illustration of how it's important to realize the complexity behind what it is we're trying to achieve, and the complexity behind even such seemingly simple things as some of the dog characteristics that we're studying and that are important to us. Beginning at the beginning, so to speak, and I'll kind of blast through these first few slides relatively quickly, just because I think by now the audience is familiar with them. The domestication process is selecting on behavior. Animals behaving are what gets impacted and in turn affects the environment around the animals, whether those animals are wolves or humans or anything else. So really, behavior is what selection is acting on. In the case of dogs, I think we're all agreed. And am I speaking into the mic enough? Am I audible to everyone? No. Oh, glad I asked. Is that better?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So in the case of dogs, those domestication events, as we've heard detailed in today's presentations, occurred at some point prior to 15,000 years before present, and judging by the dogs we see all around us, the result of that domestication process has been an incredible degree of both behavioral and morphological plasticity, the willingness of dogs to affiliate with us and with other animals around them, and also, as we've heard a couple of times, their ability to interpret human gestural communication, and indeed their desire to interpret human gestural communication. A lot of questions about domestication remained unanswered until we got some real good ideas from an experiment that was conducted in Russia that's also been referenced a couple of times today, and that's Belyev's work over in Siberia. Selection experiment that began in 1959 used the silver fox, imported 130 animals, 30 foxes and 100 vixen fur farms in Estonia, and selected on one characteristic, and that characteristic was tameness, the tolerance for the presence of humans. And in each generation, Belyaev selected the kind of the 5% of that generation that were the tamest and showed the least aggression towards the handlers and caretakers. And as a result, as has been again discussed earlier, after a number of generations, and we're up into the 40s, I believe, there were a whole raft of changes that came along with that one selected characteristic. The picture in the upper left is the sort of the progenitor of the whole crew, one of the original silver foxes. That's what they look like in the wild, or at least a quasi-wild form that are in fur farms. And the other pictures you see are the various morphological types that have arisen from those original progenitors. So the results, the selection on that one single trait, again, the tameness trait had, precipitated pretty widespread destabilization throughout the entire organism. There were morphological changes. In other words, the examples are the ears went from erect to floppy, the legs grew longer, skull dimensions changed, as Robert Weaned talked about, coat color changed. Reproductive changes were seen, similar to the differences between wolves and dogs. Adrenal output in the selected lines went down, as opposed to serotonin levels, which were higher. It was classic kind of developmental heterochrony, or what has been referred to today as neoteny, and the illustration of what Brian Hare refers to as phylogenetic enculturation, as opposed to ontogenetic enculturation, in other words, the process of training and socialization of the individual animal. And importantly, the trait variance that you're observing was not seen in any of the parental lines. In other words, the phenotype they were observing in the parents wouldn't have led them to predict these specific trait variances in the offspring. They were invisible until the selection occurred. Those trait variances are also present, as we've heard, in domestic dogs, and they kind of led the dogs into what I and others have termed the sort of traditional working roles. By traditional working roles, I'm not talking about companionship or food source, but rather, the classic, assistance in transportation. In other words, sled or sledge pulling, use as hunting dogs, use in herding livestock, use in livestock guarding, and war dogs in the sense that war dogs was originally understood. In other words, just aggressive dogs that would attack an enemy and attempt to harm them. And here are the kind of classic sort of pastoral, agricultural looking scenes of the traditional working dog. Modern working dogs are represented by assistance dogs, which are guide, hearing, and service dogs, and more about them in just a bit. Military patrol and sentry dogs, which are quite different in their actual operation than the war dog. Detector dogs that Scott's just talked about, agricultural screening, medical detection or medical screening dogs, search and rescue, and similar sorts of things. In terms of trying to count how many dogs are actually working today, that's hard to do. My best estimate, which again is just an estimate trying to use different sources of information in the kind of assistance dog world, I can estimate something like 18,000 active dogs working from ADI programs. ADI, I should say, is Assistance Dogs International, which is an umbrella group of agencies like Canine Companions for Independence or Guide Dogs for the Blind. And there may be another 12,000 dogs at any one time in training at those organizations. Military police dogs, again, my best guess, I couldn't find published numbers, I think for good reason, is that there's something like 3,000 active duty military working dogs. There are also large programs, and Scott alluded to some of them in Australia, Germany, UK, Israel, South Africa, China, and elsewhere. You know, if you kind of lump all the sort of quote-unquote governmental dogs into one pot, you come up with something like probably 100,000 animals working currently. You know, illustrations of modern working dogs. I think we saw a picture of this guy before, an agricultural detection dog, the so-called Beagle Brigade, a working assistance dog graduated from CCI, military working dogs in various types of deployment. And when we think about the way traditional working dogs and working dog roles compare to modern working dogs, you know, in both cases, by and large, you're relying on sort of the same sets of motor skills and sensory acuity, whether it's olfactory or visual acuity. You know, selection of successful parents or successful animals to be parents, in other words, selective breeding, will improve the performance of the offspring. And in both modern and traditional sorts of work, early socialization, adaptation is a pretty clear way to improve the performance of individual animals. Looking at the differences between them, one of the things, and again, it's something that I think probably Scott did a very good job of bringing home. Many of the programs today are much larger than the programs that, or individuals in many cases, that produced the dogs that are working or were working in traditional jobs. And what that means is that it gives us some abilities that breeders and programs of previous generations didn't have. You know, we're producing enough dogs, many of our programs, that our selection is amenable to certain statistical techniques to allow us to select more effectively across an array of traits, which is a good thing. Balancing that, given the jobs and the ever-increasing demands on the dogs, the environmental challenges that the dogs face in actually doing their jobs are certainly higher than they were, and part of those environmental challenges are the societal expectations. You know, what's considered, and certainly in my field, where the dogs are you know, out and about in public all the time. You know, what's considered acceptable behavior today for a dog is much different, even in the 20 or so years that I've been working in the field, much less you know, the 50 years prior to that. What people consider acceptable kind of public behavior for a dog is you know, a generation ago would have been kind of on the extreme end of the distribution of dog behavior, and a lot of what counted as normal dog behavior is today considered kind of an unacceptable interruption in public life. And of course, training is for many of these modern roles, training is kind of more clearly instrumental. In other words, you're setting up sorts of reward contingencies to get the dogs to do things that perhaps they're not innately driven to do by sorts of inborn drives and instincts. So the challenges that all of our programs face, you know, producing them, whether you're talking about you know, Scott's sort of program that's out trying to produce detector dogs, or my sort of program that's producing dogs for people with disabilities. We're trying to you know, reduce the number of dogs that don't succeed, that can't meet the criteria for success. And of course, we're trying to reduce that failure rate by doing something other than simply lowering the criteria for success. It's important to note that you know, when we talk about failure, and it sometimes surprises people that most reasons for failure are actually behavioral. You know, certainly there are plenty of dogs that don't succeed for a variety of medical reasons, and we screen for an ever-increasing number of medical things to try to prevent that. But the majority of failures in almost any field, any kind of dog program are indeed behavioral. The other problems that we face, and it goes hand in hand with one of the reasons why we're certainly trying to reduce failure rates, is that the demand today is going up and up, and so the ability to meet that demand is pretty much exerting fairly constant pressure on all of our programs. With our kind of larger breeding colonies, one thing that we're kind of always running back and forth between, and something that Scott was acknowledging a little bit in his talk is trying to balance that, the selection that you want to achieve with the increase in inbreeding that you want to, for the most part, stay away from, and that's a compromise. And of course, there are. It's one of those. The more you learn, the more you realize how little you actually know. There are significant gaps in our knowledge in certain fairly basic areas in terms of how to make the dog successful. So the examples that I'll be turning to now come from, naturally enough, where I work, Canine Companions for Independence. We're a nonprofit organization. I've been in existence about 35 years. We place service, hearing, skill companion, and facility dogs with people, primarily disabled children and adults with disabilities. We're located, at least our headquarters and breeding center, are located in Santa Rosa, California. In addition to Santa Rosa, there are 4 other training centers. There's one in Southern California, one in Ohio, one in Florida, and one on Long Island, New York. And I think it's probably important for, well, perhaps this audience already knows, but I should probably clarify the terminology. Legally speaking or legislatively speaking, a service dog or service animal is kind of the umbrella concept of a dog that's going to work with somebody with a disability. The Department of Justice just came out with kind of a revised Americans with Disability Act regulation. In Title II, they define a service animal slightly more narrowly than the original ADA defined it. And I've helpfully highlighted and read the key words in this definition. A service animal is any dog individually trained to perform actual tasks directly related to the handler's disability. So kind of implicit in that definition is the fact that things that dogs might accomplish simply by virtue of being dogs would not necessarily qualify the dog as a service animal. In other words, if I'm comforted by the presence of a dog, that doesn't necessarily count that dog as a service animal because it hasn't been individually trained to perform a specific task. Now, there are tasks that I could certainly imagine training that dog to do to qualify it, but simply, dog qua dog doesn't qualify you as a service animal. Now, the reason I wanted to define this in part is to clarify or avoid the confusion that I'm probably about to introduce. Within the industry, service dog generally refers to a dog that works with somebody with an orthopedic or mobility impairment, and the umbrella term is assistance dog. And that's probably how I'll refer to it because that's the way I refer to it every day. But legislatively, service animal is the umbrella concept. So, for instance, in this slide, what I'm calling a service dog here is a subspecies of an assistance dog, and it has the following characteristics. The handler has a disability, typically some sort of mobility impairment, and the service dog goes everywhere pretty much with the handler, in other words, to work, to school, if in school, out in public, at home. And the sorts of the tasks, the activities that the dog does to kind of mitigate the effects of the disability are kind of the things that you would probably imagine the dog would do. Retrieving dropped items, opening and closing drawers, or turning lights on and off if the person also has upper body impairments that preclude reaching for a switch, pulling a wheelchair in some cases if the person is a manual wheelchair user. And at least at CCI and probably in most organizations, we use Labrador retrievers, golden retrievers, and crosses of the two as these dogs. Hearing dog, another common type of dog that we place at Canine Companions for Independence, works with a person who is deaf or hearing impaired. Again, the dog accompanies the handler everywhere in all kind of aspects of their life. And the primary activity of the hearing dog really consists of alerting to a significant sound in the environment, alerting the handler, that is, to the sound. And the handler is the person who's defining what's significant. And again, currently we use Labs, Goldens, and crossbreeds for hearing dogs. And the way, this is specific to canine companions, but not so atypical that you wouldn't find it at most organizations. From 0 to 7 weeks, the dog is in the litter. It's pretty much always whelped in the home of a volunteer. It's the keeper of the brood, the dam. It typically whelps the litter out. When the litter is 8 weeks old, and those people all live around Santa Rosa, California. At 8 weeks old, the litter is turned into our headquarters in Santa Rosa. The litter gets a kind of a veterinary exam, and either gets adopted out to a volunteer family who will raise them, or if it's destined for eventual training and placement at one of the other regional centers, the puppies are shipped to them, where they're then adopted out to a family or a person to raise. So from 2 to 18 months, the pups are raised individually in the homes of volunteer puppy raisers. At 18 months, they turn into one of the 5 training centers for training. They're in training for about 6 months. At the end of that time, a class of dogs is ready, and a class of people to receive the dog gets invited in. They stay kind of in a dormitory style setup for 2 weeks. Learn to use the dogs, and graduate and go off to remain together for probably about 8 years. In other words, from the time the dog's about 2 years old until dog's 10 or so. So the physical requirements for our animals are, in part, very typical things for the breeds that we use. We check orthopedic health on the dogs. We do pen, hip, and OFA. Do X-ray and read their elbow radiographs to ensure that they're free of elbow dysplasia. Do heart checks on the dogs. Currently, we also do the exercise-induced collapse after we realized that was segregating through our population. We score the skin of the animals. In our case, unfortunately, in our population, atopy is a fairly significant, medical release. The dog needs to have, because of what it does, the dog needs to have a long working life. It's not only cost-effective for us to try to maximize the working life, but obviously it's the bond that forms between the handler and the dog is a close one, and so we want to kind of have it go naturally enough as long as we can. Given those tasks that the dogs perform, the body size needs to be a certain size. Body condition scoring or their appropriate weight is a problem for us as well. Obesity tends to be a large problem in our population, like in the populations of retrievers generally. And the dogs need a healthy GI system, both for all the reasons you'd imagine in terms of their immune function and overall health, and also because the dogs are in public so often that essentially frequent GI problems really can't be tolerated. Turning from the medical requirements to the behavioral requirements, the dogs need to be suited to the work they're going to be asked to do. And that means they're very easy to motivate. They're rewarded pretty much by working for a person, by the task performance, because that's ultimately what we rely on. Especially in the case of the service dogs, the person has, at least in our kind of hypothetical person that we're training for, has very little ability to physically manipulate the dog or correct the dog, or so we want the dog ideally controllable entirely by voice command. Dog needs to be capable of learning the behaviors that we need to teach it within kind of our schedule, which is 6 months of training. Needs to adapt well to transitions in housing and transitions in handler, because that's again kind of the way our program is set up. Needs to be comfortable in a wide variety of environments, and needs to have a high arousal threshold. All the sorts of negative traits that Scott was describing that cause him indigestion when he sees them, that's like the perfect CCI dog. The dogs that he's looking for really are nightmares in our world. Interestingly enough, I mean our success rate currently, if you take our population overall and look at our success rate currently, it's right about 44, 46%, and that's kind of birth to placement. If you look at our success rate with dogs that we acquire from the outside, and of course we do, Scott talked about the open colony versus closed colony. Our breeding colony is by and large closed, except we do bring outside stock in every once in a while, primarily just to keep the level of inbreeding tolerable. And we carefully screen. I mean, we talk to breeders, we look at pedigrees, we examine the health data on the dogs, we bring the dogs in. And so these aren't kind of random dogs that we're going out and tripping over. They're dogs that we've scouted and kind of done our homework on. Our success rate with those dogs is about 12%. And so clearly, what's happened in the history of CCI's breeding program is that we've taken dogs that were kind of moderately well adapted for what we wanted them to do, and we've pushed them kind of even further in a particular direction. And obviously we're still pushing hard because as I said at the beginning, we're hoping for as many successful dogs as possible given the demand for the dogs. So anyway, it's time to kind of turn to a couple of examples, and again, I'm going to I've selected examples here that really illustrate both how little I, at least personally, know about so many things that go into making successful animals in our program, and also how little things really can make a fairly substantial difference in the success of what you're doing and in the success of the dogs. So we decided to do at Canine Companions this sort of retrospective study looking at is there an effect of parity number on the offspring? And parity number simply means litter number. In other words, the first litter a dam has, that's parity 1, second litter is parity 2, etc. And it's an interesting question for us at CCI or for any breeding program because, as I said, you're balancing, the different change in, the amount you want to select versus the amount you're willing to allow inbreeding to go up. So the number of breeding individuals that you want to select out each generation is directly affecting that. How many litters each bitch who is a breeder is going to have is also going to affect that. So that's a kind of a question for us. Other questions, of course, are how many litters should a dam have to maintain her health, and are there parity effects just by virtue of which parity the dog was born in on the offspring. So, as I said, it's a retrospective analysis that we did on reproductive performance and on puppy outcomes. And we looked at about 750 litters. That represented some 5,800 puppies. So first thing, the simplest thing to look at is, so what's the litter size by parity? I apologize, it may be a somewhat difficult graph to read. It's actually kind of inverted, maybe from what you'd expect. Parity 1 is on top. It's the first horizontal bar. Parity 5 is on the bottom. And if you just look at the trend of the bars, I think it's pretty clear that parity 2 has your largest litter size in it, and then it tends to decrease from there right down to parity 5, which has a kind of substantially smaller looking litter size than the earlier ones.